concept 4, we're going to be talking about phylogeny. So that's probably a word you have no idea what it is, but we're going to talk about it, so hopefully you will by the end of the video. Kind of reviewing really quick, remember taxonomy, that's going to be a field of biology that classifies organisms. So we're going to organize organisms by similar characteristics, what they have in common. All of life we can separate into 3 big broad groups that are called domains. Those domains are eubacteria, archaebacteria, and eukarya. So eubacteria are prokaryotes that are what we consider true bacteria. So these are the bacteria that you would typically think about with getting an infection or for gut health in order to help you break down food, etc. Archaebacteria, these are going to be prokaryotes that live in extreme environments like super salty water or in deep hydrothermal vents or in volcanoes or just somewhere that's kind of outrageous for anything else to live in. And then you have eukarya, which is eukaryotes. So most of everything that you consider living that comes to your mind when you think about organisms probably fall under eukarya. And then the domains are further subdivided. So domain, then it's split up into kingdoms. Kingdoms are then split up into phylum. Then you got class, order, family, genus, and species. So this is really interesting because this filing system changes as we find new organisms, because if we find an organism that kind of doesn't fit into one group and fit into the other, we kind of have to reclassify what our boxes are to put those organisms in. So this whole idea of taxonomy came from a guy named Carlos Linnaeus, so he's designated the father of taxonomy, and he came up with this idea of a binomial nomenclature system. So the prefix bi means 2. Nomenclature or nomial talks about names. So this is a 2-name naming system, and it's specifically going to be the genus name and the species name. So remember back to here, the genus and the species are the 2 most specific levels of taxonomy. With my scientific name, it's always going to be in italics, so that's the slanty font. The genus is going to be capitalized and the species name is not going to be capitalized. So here we have pictures of 2 bears. You might know them by their common names, brown bear, grizzly bear, or Kodiak bear. And then you have a polar bear. The reason why we have scientific names is because it kind of creates a universal naming system that everybody can agree on, to whereas common names are very localized. People call things different names based on where you live. Think about the difference between just saying lightning bug and firefly. It depends on where you live. So scientific names kind of eliminate that confusion. So brown bears, their name is Ursus arctos. And then polar bears are Ursus maritimus. What we know is these are 2 different species because they have different species names. However, they share the same genus name. And that makes sense because polar bears and grizzly bears are very, very similar. So when we're talking about phylogeny, we're looking at the evolutionary history of a species. And looking at that on the absolute broadest sense, scientists believe that the first type of life form was a prokaryote. So that kind of makes sense because they're very simple. They don't have a lot going on. We talked about that in our cells unit. And they believe that the first eukaryote evolved through the process of endosymbiosis. So endo means inside, right? And then symbiosis means living together. So this is where one prokaryote ended up inside of another one, and it was kind of a win-win situation. So they think that the prokaryote that went inside of the other one ended up being organelles, those membrane-bound organelles like we talked about that were specific to eukaryotes that prokaryotes didn't have, like mitochondria and chloroplasts and things on that line. So the endosymbiotic theory suggests that over time, coevolution of those 2 prokaryotes occurred and eventually led to speciation of different types of eukaryotes away from prokaryotes. So this is kind of the the common ancestor for all eukaryotes, and then phylogeny works to piece together the evolutionary history of relatedness between everybody else via shared characteristics. We can kind of map these and see these visually using a phylogenetic tree. So this is going to be a diagram used to predict evolutionary relationships among groups of organisms. All of our branch points here, these show new species that came about from an ancestor. And we build these based upon either shared morphology, so like shared physical characteristics, upon genes, or upon behaviors. Obviously, behaviors isn't your strongest, probably scientific evidence for relatedness, but I digress. And we do these by using maximum parsimony, which means that we're using the simplest explanation for creating the tree. We're not trying to come up with like some crazy conspiracy theory about how this one organism is so different than the other ones, but yet it's somehow more related. So these are going to be classifying organisms into major taxa, which are just called groups based on their relationships. And so it's going to classify the groups of species in the order of which they descended from a common ancestor using my homologous features. So remember what they have in common. Any heritable traits like DNA or proteins or anatomical structures are going to be the result of divergent evolution here because they are sharing a common ancestor. So what can we learn from looking at a phylogenetic tree? We can learn which groups are more closely related, which groups are least closely related, and which group diverged first, which means which group speciated longer ago. So let's talk about how to read them. The root is the base that represents a common ancestor. So this blue circle here would be the root for this particular phylogenetic tree. And then as you move away from the root, you're moving further in time. So this is the oldest species, and then A through F are all species that would be current species except for B, which we'll talk about in a second. So speciation is occurring whenever you have branching of this tree. So anytime you have this split here, this is saying that new species came about from this one. And then extinction is the loss of one of the branches. So a lot of times they'll kind of put this little line here saying no more, they're gone. So each one of these nodes are going to represent, each one of the branching points are called nodes, and they represent a common ancestor. So we can look at these and kind of determine where the most recent common ancestor is by which splitting point, which node is closer to the present. So in this case, the blue circle is the oldest common ancestor, and then the one up here would be the most recent ancestor that only E and F share. While it's important to know how to read these, it's also important to know how not to read these. So they do not show that one organism is directly descended from another one. So it's not saying that amoebas came from bacteria, insects came from amoebas, trouts came from insects, humans came from trout, and then birds came from humans. We know that doesn't make sense. That's what these branching points are kind of talking about. Those are the common ancestors that would have speciated to ultimately come about with these other species up here. And they do not show levels of complexity. So in this situation, it's not saying that bacteria are the least complex and birds are the most complex. That's not the case at all. It depends on which organisms are on your phylogenetic tree and what you're looking at as far as commonalities to show the branching points. So when we look at these, let's see what we can determine from these. We've got prosimians, New World monkeys, chimpanzees, humans, gorillas, orangutans, gibbons, and Old World monkeys. So looking at this, you should be able to tell me which one of these species is the oldest species, which one diverged or speciated first. So that would be the prosimians, because if I have my first original branch point here, it branches off to the prosimians, and then this ancestor that we don't have a name for, but then created New World monkeys, and then this other species that we don't have a name for. If you had to say which one of these organisms are more closely related to humans, what would you say? So anytime that you're asked which are more closely related based on this phylogenetic tree, you're going to go to the most recent common ancestor. So humans, I go down here to this split point, which is my most recent common ancestor. Who shares this ancestor? So in this case, it would be chimpanzees. So humans and chimpanzees would be more closely related than humans and gorillas, or humans and New World monkeys, etc., etc. So then if you have a situation, let's say I asked, who is more closely related to orangutans, gibbons or gorillas? They're all kind of like one shift in one direction, one shift in the other direction away from orangutans. So how would I know? Well, I go to my most recent common ancestor, so I track this line down. Here's my most recent ancestor for orangutans. Do gibbons share that ancestor? They don't. But who does? The gorillas. So in that case, orangutans would be more closely related to gorillas than to gibbons.